Still fair.
Hey, there we go, on air. Hey everyone, it's Christy. How are you doing? I hope you're having a good afternoon, evening, morning, whenever you are. I am having a conversation tonight with a recent friend of mine via Kevin, the Cognitive Society. We actually talked first about Jordan Peterson, and then I had a point that I realized I have a difficult time sometimes knowing if I should use the term fascist or totalitarian or authoritarianism. I'm a voting behavioral. I study voting behavior, and therefore I mostly focus on democracy. That's my specialty. So I know you, Cog, have spent hours studying fascism, and therefore I thought we could just have a conversation. We are going to talk about some of the terms here, but yeah, first of all, thanks for agreeing to come on and talk about this.
No, not at all. Thanks for having me on. This should be a really interesting conversation because hopefully we're going to dive into some of the distinctions between authoritarianism, totalitarianism, fascism, and how they relate to Trump and Brexit.
Yes. So before we start, do you want to, just for people who might not know you, talk a little bit about like your interest in this and how much, time you spent studying this, and just a little bit about your background and interest.
In terms of dealing with the far right, I've been dealing with the far right since around 2012, 2013, when I was heavily involved in movements against a far right group called Britain First. But in terms of actual studying, I'm a history student who's just graduating, and I specialize in Third Reich history. And so the Nazis are like one of the areas I look at, along with kind of the social aspects of fascism itself, and the way that, in some ways, the way it relates to totalitarianism and authoritarianism, and the way that these terms really can't properly be defined.
Right. This is unfortunately the first time in my life I really had to pay attention to these concepts, because this is the first time in my lifetime that I've seen we've got what I would say is somebody with fascist leanings, tendencies, proclivities, agenda in the White House. And it's taken me a long time to get to that point, I think in part because I didn't have a really clear understanding of some of these terms. And you mentioned some of them before, and I might have too, but we should mention totalitarian, authoritarianism, and fascism. So before we start actually talking about the history or where things are now, let's look at some terms and get them out of the way, and focus on the ones we want and understand the other ones, where they go. So can we look at authoritarianism first? Because that's what I have first up on the Wikipedia.
I'm smiling because I'm trying not to laugh at the idea that you can spend 5 or 6 minutes on definitions and then talk about the history. Of my experience of history and politics is that quite often you end up talking about definitions for most of the time, because you're just trying to work out what you're talking about. So that was quite a funny idea to me. Sorry.
Right. Well, at least in this, my goal is to try to at least get beyond move authoritarianism and totalitarianism aside, so that we can focus on fascism. So hopefully we'll I think I understand it now, but this is Wikipedia. We all know is the great internet source, but it's not just Wikipedia. They're quoting Juan Linz, a political scientist who also organized authoritarian political systems into 4 qualities. But it is an overall term. It says here in Wiki, authoritarianism is a form of government characterized by strong central power and limited political freedoms. Under an authoritarian regime, individual freedoms are subordinate to the state, and there are no constitutional accountability and no rule of law. Authoritarian regimes can be autocratic with power concentrated in one person, or can be a committee with power shared among officials and government institutions. The political scientist Juan Linz synthesized authoritarian political systems as possessing 4 qualities. 1, limited political pluralism, realized with legalistic constraints on the legislature, political parties, and interest groups. And that's basically saying is pluralism as a diversity of voices. And so that's what they're saying, realized as enacted through legalistic constraints on those other potential locations of political diversity. 2, political legitimacy based upon appeals to emotion and identification of the regime as a necessary evil to combat enemies of the people, socioeconomic underdevelopment, and guerrilla insurgency. 3, minimal social mobilization consequent to legalistic constraints such as political suppression of all anti-regime activities. And that's a really complicated way of saying like putting down dissent, I think is when I interpret it. 4, informally defined executive powers, which extend and allow government authority into every sphere of life. So it's sort of like a conceptual category. And then, is there anything you want to? I'm sorry, I'm just reading Cog. So, do you want to jump in here, or should we go to totalitarianism first or next?
No, I can think of a lot of areas where Nazism fits into that bracket. So I just want to point out, just in case it wasn't clear, that these are not mutually exclusive terms.
Correct.
I think that's worth pointing out. We are not saying that they are completely separate at all times, but there are distinctions between them.
Right, and in some ways, I've started to think about it like those nestling Russian dolls, with authoritarianism being the bigger one, and then totalitarianism being inside, and then fascism being. But we'll see if that's an appropriate analogy. Now, fascism is actually a form of authoritarianism, according to this. So totalitarianism is a political concept of a mode of government that prohibits opposition parties, restricts individual opposition to the state and its claims, and exercises a high degree of control over public and private life. It is regarded as the most extreme and complete form of authoritarianism. So the reason why it's the most extreme and complete form is political power is held by one ruler, but and they have propaganda machines, yada yada yada. But this is the distinction. Whereas it's not only that they have control over the state, but they also have an ideology that they try to impose. It's a little bit farther down, which is why I'm searching for the words here. Right. In contrast, a totalitarian regime attempts to control virtually all aspects of the social life, including the economy, education, art, science, private life, and morals of citizens. And some totalitarian governments may promote an elaborate ideology. And that is why you can have, if you imagine like a secular authoritarian government that is basically, as long as you stay out of the government's way, they're kind of happy for you to do your thing. Whereas if you have like a religious ideological, or in this case, like a fascist one, like Nazi ideology, underpinning it, when it's all encompassing, then it's totalitarianism. That's my understanding. And then I think fascism is a category of a totalitarian form of government. And that's where I got to the nestling dolls thing. Hello, Kevin in the chat.
Yeah, Kevin is doing his thing in the chat. I wonder why Kevin got demonetized. It is a mystery we shall never know.
And so we had a long talk about this before to try to get some of these concepts, distinguished as well. And I think that this process has been very useful for me to now see it. And so now I'm going to kick it over to you. Your thoughts on the way these terms are being used versus these categories.
Well, in terms of the categories, I rarely think it gets to the point where we have to look at them as a cross-referential thing. A lot of the time when people are using the term fascism, what they just mean is effectively being a thug. They're talking about, it's not even necessarily totalitarian or authoritarian. They're just talking about being violent a lot of the time. They don't seem to understand that fascism is a distinct political ideology, and it's of the right wing. You cannot have left-wing fascism. It just isn't a thing.
Right.
It's like trying to claim right-wing communism. There's no such thing as right-wing communism. It's just not a thing. Right. You have some communists who might be more right-wing than other communists, but they are still to the far left of the political spectrum as we view it in larger terms. In terms of the distinction between totalitarianism and authoritarianism, there's a piece from Bracker, who is a West German historian, on totalitarianism itself and the ways in which it is distinct from authoritarianism. And it covered a lot of what you read there in the Wikipedia article, but it also mentions a fictional identity of the ruler themselves. It's slightly more than just a cult of personality, but a false sort of cult of personality built around that distinct ideology that you were talking about. And what's the other thing? This idea of a total rule, total control. Yeah, I think that's pretty much all I really wanted to add to that, without going into other areas, which I presume we'll get to, so I shall hold my tongue.
Yeah, well, I was going to segue into a phrase that you mentioned in our pre-show conversation. Is this a good time now to bring up the umbrella of fascism? So we have authoritarianism, and then totalitarianism is like on the extreme end of possible forms of authoritarianism. And then fascism is, as it says here in the article, which I've taken off the screen now, but it says radical right-wing authoritarian ultra-nationalism. Yeah. But within that, there are different types or categories of, or whatever, brands of fascism. And you mentioned the umbrella. So that's what I was.
Yeah, so the way that I would kind of look at it is... Sorry, I'm writing stuff down. Give me a second.
It's okay. No, I was just thinking, I feel like I'm on a panel and you're writing down the question before you answer it. So that's actually...
Yeah, well, actually what I was doing was I was like visualizing it, because if I have no idea if people will be able to see that.
Yeah. Let me just lock on you. I'll just lock on you.
Yeah, the idea is that fascism now is being used as a term which generally means an umbrella term for different types of fascist regimes. So fascismo is the one with the term which people most associate with fascism itself, because it's where the word comes from, but it's the Italian fascismo.
It's falling higher.
Oh, sorry.
No, we can see it. You just it's dropped off the screen a little bit.
I should have done this via I should have like drawn it earlier, but I forgot to. I was busy today. Yeah, so it's an umbrella term, and within that falls Nazism, Spanish fascism, for example, Chilean fascism. You've got and fascismo itself. And I think using it as an umbrella term helps for a better understanding. Another way you could refer to it is Urfascism, which is Umberto Eco's term. I think Umberto Eco plays quite a big role in the way that we use the term fascism now. But yeah, I think that's what I want to go with.
Yeah, excellent. So no questions from the chat yet. Some more lewd comments from Kevin, but other than that, so if people do have questions or don't need things clarified, you can jump in and I'll keep an eye on that. Because if you don't, I'm just going to assume you're following along and we're going to keep going. One of the other things we discussed was the characteristics that you, I mean, a lot of people have, oh, sorry, before to do a step back. So I mentioned to you that I struggle a little bit to conceptualize fascism because unlike democracy or other kinds of dictatorial regimes, I think the kind of fascism we're facing now isn't like an organized political party. I mean, it's becoming so in the United States, to be honest, more and more. But their ideas, it seems to be individuals are using their free speech rights. So in terms of identifying what is and isn't, fascism, can you give some of the characteristics, some of the elements of it that help us identify, yeah, those are the kinds of things that a fascist would say? Not saying you're a fascist, but I'm saying you're saying things that, fascists would agree with.
Yeah, I have like a list of traits which I often pull out to kind of identify fascism itself. And so what I would look for, there are a whole list of things, and I've discussed them actually on Let Them Eat Cake with Mike and Kevin before, but it's worth saying that some of these things that can cross over, Umberto Eco has it right when he describes fascism as a sine which is like a term for something like the way Wittgenstein describes games. If you think of a game, if you think of chess and you think of basketball, they are both played physically, but beyond that, there is very little that connects them, but they are both described as games. And in the same way as games is a sine in that there's no one unique element that makes something into a game, fascism is very similar in that bits can be missing, but there's certain traits that keep reoccurring. And the traits that I've identified are social conservatism, a conspiracy theory culture, a sense of anti-intellectualism with ultra-nationalism. The anti-intellectualism itself, I was discussing with Christy yesterday, is very much tied to the anti-feminism element, because thinking itself is seen as emasculating. And there's like a whole link there. If you think of the way that men are encouraged to think about masculinity, it is entirely unachievable at all times. But that's the idea. If it's unachievable at all times, you will be pushing away logical thought in order to try to reach that unattainable goal that you will never reach. But that turns fascism effectively into a community of action. So with Brexit, it's disregard what experts say. You know, we need to take action. Brexit means Brexit. Let's just get on with it. You know, it's all about the action itself. It's never a nuanced discussion of the thought. They might say we believe in democracy, but it's beyond the taglines. There's nothing under there. Brexit means Brexit is a meaningless phrase. Shall I pause there to discuss those terms?
No. Let's. What maybe we can do is you can go through them, and then we can use it as a framework to look at examples of how they manifest in the past, and then we use a framework again by looking at actions today and seeing if we can also see patterns in the news headlines. If that's okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So let's finish the list. Yeah.
Okay. We've got high use of terror or violence, which is another thing that can be used. And there's a term, palingenesis. I often miswrite it as pangenesis. It's not pangenesis, it's palingenesis. Don't make that mistake. But the term palingenesis means a national rebirth. So it's terms like "Make America Great Again," or this idea that the Brexit revival, of reviving the empire of the past, you know, making Britain great again, or Hitler literally used the term "make Germany great again." So there's always this idea of a national revival, and to me, that's what Brexit has become. It's become this idea of a Volksgemeinschaft, a people's community of purity. And if only we could get rid of X, Y, and Z people. They don't think of it this way, of course, but if only we could get rid of X, Y, and Z people, then everything would be great, and you know, society would run.
No, they think about it in that way. I've heard them talk about it in that way, basically. Yeah. I mean, people in focus groups, just, you know, conservative voters, UKIP voters, that's definitely how they talk about it. Yeah, we're only a small island. But sorry.
Yes, yeah, but the thing is that's the other weird thing about fascism, of course, is that whether you are a conservative or you are like a hardline Nazi, if you're kind of supporting that framework of ideology, you might not think of that way. And I think a lot of the people who were dying defending Berlin in 1945, I think a lot of them were probably just sort of middle of the road conservatives, like as you know, in terms of what ideology they would pick if they kind of had the choice. But they had very much chosen to support Nazis and fascists. And so I would describe them as fascists. So when I say that people like Sargon, who, you know, when I say that Sargon is a fascist, I'm not, you know, directly saying he's a Nazi of the hardest kind. What I'm saying is that he props up that regime, and therefore he's, you know, or props up that ideology, and therefore he is complicit in it. Because it's very hard to tell the distinction. There's a whole stack of historiography on this. It's really hard to tell the distinction between complicity and conformity, and resistance and conformity. That there's so many lines that cross over each other without ever really connecting. Sorry, I got massively distracted. I'll get back to the list.
It was interesting.
I've been over the community of action. Scapegoating and xenophobia are massive parts of fascism itself, and it's tied to the nationalism because, as I think I've said before, nationalism itself has to define itself in the negative. You have to define yourself, if you are a nationality, by not being another nationality, because there is no one unique trait of a nationality. You know, there's no one unique trait that makes someone British or French. The biggest trait that makes them British is that they are not French. and I think that's worth kind of bearing in mind. There's the enemy which is simultaneously too weak and too strong. So if you think of the European Union, it's simultaneously the weakest, and and it's moments from collapse, but it's also a really evil empire that we need to get rid of. It's basically the Fourth Reich, as I've heard, or the, depending on which side of the political spectrum they fall. People, Brexiteers describe it as the Fourth Reich, or they describe it as I think it's the USSEU, they called it, a sort of a play on the USSR. But yeah, being anti-Marxist, anti-trade unionist, anti-judiciary, anti-liberal, anti-cosmopolitanism.
Can you just take a moment and say what cosmopolitanism is in order to explain what anti-cosmopolitanism is?
Okay, so cosmopolitanism, I think I would describe it as an openness to different cultures and kind of. I would describe. I think.
Should I look it up? Should I not put you on the spot? I do have Wikipedia up here.
Yeah, I would usually use it by giving these. I would usually say, as an example, freedom of movement is like the most cosmopolitan principle that you could come up with, because it is the idea that people should be able to integrate and move across borders totally freely and without prejudice. I don't actually know if that fits the.
Yeah, you're not far off. Yeah. So it says here, cosmopolitanism is the ideology that all human beings belong to a single community based on a shared morality. A cosmopolitan community might be based on an inclusive morality, a shared economic relationship or political structure that encompasses different nations. In a cosmopolitan community, individuals from different places form relationships of mutual respect. Yeah, so basically it has come to, what it says here, cosmopolitanism has come to stand for peace and harmony among nations, founded upon understanding, tolerance, and interdependence. There we go.
Yeah.
Thank you, Vicky.
Yeah, it is kind of the most it's the opposite end to
of openness, yeah.
To what fascism kind of stands for in many ways. Because fascism is all about fear and being closed off and being part of a community of purity in some ways. It might not be, when I say purity, people think, racial purity, so it must be about racists. Not necessarily. Sometimes, sometimes people who you might think might be a minority or might become a victim in that regime can be some of the most ardent supporters of that regime. And it seems self-contradictory, but it's worth bearing in mind that fascism itself is entirely self-contradictory. The idea that you could streamline their ideas and lay them out perfectly is just nonsense. So looking for that kind of logic of, but you would be a victim of this regime, often doesn't cut it.
Right. Sorry, continuing on with your list, unless you were.
Yes. I've used the Orwellian terms newspeak and doublethink, but what I mean by that is there's often a development of language that appears around fascism, and it's often quite meaningless. For example, the idea of Sieg Heil, the meaningless slogan that the Nazis shouted, and it translates to "Hail to victory" or "Hail victory." Mm-hmm. It's just a meaningless phrase, but it's like Brexit means Brexit. They stand up at rallies nowadays and they say Brexit means Brexit. Doesn't mean anything, but it's
like a rallying cry.
Yeah, it's a whole. The thing is once an ideology becomes beyond merely just a little bit self-contradictory and to where it starts to sort of fold in on itself, then you start to get language developing which is trying to accommodate for that, but seriously failing. It is very much the understanding that you have to kind of forget what you know and just sort of go with what is popular. Don't think too much about the Irish border because if you think too much about the Irish border, your ideas fall apart, because you are simultaneously asking, in the case of Brexit, for a hard Irish border and an Irish border across which there is free movement. And of course, two self-contradictory ideas. You can't have a soft Irish border with free movement and simultaneously have tight immigration controls. Sorry, I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking.
That's all right. I did a lot of talking at first, and it's your list, so you should be talking.
Yeah, I would perhaps add the idea of Hannah Arendt's idea of radical evil, a sort of evil that is so it's reached a point where it's so self-consuming it has become pointless. And this is something that runs not just across fascism, actually, but it runs into totalitarianism. And I think totalitarianism is perhaps where that particular bracket fits a bit more. But I added it to the list for fascism anyway, because it so often happens that they're kind of self-consuming ideologies.
Okay. And was that the last point?
Yes. Sorry. Yes, that was the last point.
That's okay. I didn't have your list, so I didn't know.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, having those, can we maybe look historically first and go through them again from the top? And you can illustrate it with examples, because the other thing is, it seems fascism is about gaining power. It has, it has an ideology, but it's willing to say anything in order to get power, in order to enact the ideology. It seems in that way you're saying like a lot of self-contradiction. So, yeah, I think it will help people if they can see more concrete examples historically, and then we can again take it forward. So from the top, now that we know your categories.
Yes, I would say slightly that it is willing to say almost anything in order to gain power, but at the same time it does have a flow and a certain energy that moves one certain way.
I would agree with that. Yeah. But on the small stuff, it's
it can't contradict its like core principles. Like if it suddenly started being cosmopolitan, for example, and really open and borderless, you'd have to go, well, that's no longer fascism. It just doesn't fit the definition. Whereas I think there are some things that it can let go of. Or it can at least hide. For example, anti-Marxism. If you think of the 1939 the Nazi-Soviet pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, just before the start of the Second World War. I think that's perhaps an example of where things were dropped for convenience in order to gain an upper hand, and then because it is an ideology which has to be constantly on the move. And it was, interestingly, I think it was Bracker who said that Nazism is in constant motion, like a soldier on a battlefield has to be in constant motion, because that is the sort of base instinct of the warrior, to be in constant motion, or at least that's the way it's viewed. There's an element of motion about it, but this is all very kind of conceptual and all very kind of difficult to pin down. Shall I get on with the list? Sorry,
no. It was
wasting.
Go ahead. Don't say
wasting
sorry.
time talking about.
We're here to chat. It's fine.
Yeah. So starting from the top, social conservatism. Now, I'm sure the obvious one, which everyone will go to, is the Concordat, which the Nazis had with the. I'm going to stick to the Nazis for my examples, just because that's the field I know best.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, and the Concordat, which the church, the Catholic Church, agreed with the Nazis. Now, the Catholic Church itself was conservative, but the Concordat effectively was a protection for Catholics themselves, so long as they didn't interfere too much in politics. That's sort of the base of what the Concordat was. And it's sort of allying itself with social conservatism in order to, or largely because it believes in it. So it believes in the good of the family, of family life, of keeping yourself to yourself and to local communities, and to tradition, whether that tradition is actually a real tradition or not, which is where things perhaps get interesting. So you've got this idea of conspiracy theory, which constantly runs throughout. I use, for example, the idea of the Reichstag fire being started by a communist. I think I'm right in saying that I've forgotten his name, Marinus van der Lubbe, who started the Reichstag fire. I think I'm right in saying that he was insane, or he is now considered to be an insane person rather than a communist. But certainly conspiracy theory runs throughout, and obviously anti-Semitic conspiracy theory is the other big one in the Nazi regime. You've got the idea of anti-intellectualism. Hitler absolutely hated men of letters and people who wrote for a living, because ultimately you can't have these fascist ideas and have them be totally self-contradictory and expect intellectuals to be quiet, because they will not be quiet. And yeah, so anti-intellectualism is at the very core of it, but it's also linked to this kind of masculinity, in that in order to be in constant motion and to be an ideology or a community of action, you need to be anti-intellectual, because you can't waste time thinking. You've got to act. You've got to act for the state. You've got to be a warrior. You can't waste time thinking.
Questioning, critiquing.
Yeah, exactly. There's no time for that. We've just got to keep going. And the Nazis had their own sets of schools. They had various sets, like the Order Castles, the Napolas, the Adolf Hitler High School, and the National Socialist High School. And almost all of these produced students who were just intellectually inept, because a lot of the qualifications were to do with physical qualifications rather than things which you would need to be able to do psychologically. So it's more like getting into one of these institutions was more like joining the army than it was joining an educational institution. And employers who took on the people who graduated from these schools would often complain that they didn't have the intellectual capacity and didn't have the even the basic literacy and numeracy skills which you need in order to function in an everyday job, just in a factory.
Wow.
Yeah.
Very anti-intellectualism.
Yes, yeah, hugely. It was all about the action, and that they were terribly obedient. They were really obedient. It's just that they were completely inept at whatever you asked them to do. I don't think I really need to go over the idea of terror. I'm not sure if I mentioned that the first time I read this. I think I might have missed that one, because I thought that links to totalitarianism more, but I don't need to explain the Nazis and terror. I think there's interesting things to go into there, but in terms of examples, it's fairly obvious. The ultra-nationalism, the Nazis were always nationalists. I don't think anybody can reasonably deny that. I just, yeah.
Come on.
I think there's certain things that I don't really need to give examples for. This idea of palingenesis, of making Germany great again through Lebensraum, which is the expansion into the east, and the establishment of a greater Germany. The idea of action for action's sake is harder to pin down, but if you look at Nazi art, and I did a stream on Nazi art with Culture Shots, where we actually pull up some Nazi art and sort of distinguish what made art Aryan, what made art good, and what made art in the Nazi view. And one of the things is that all of their art is evoking certain images. And if it was about men, it was usually images of either family life or war, which were the two spheres which they saw men as being good in. Even as a breadwinner, the idea was you were a breadwinner for the family. Women were just there to produce babies. I mean, to put it bluntly, you're just there to produce babies. Yeah, they're literally just a child-making machine. Sorry, Christy. Yeah.
No, that's they're not the first people to come up with that attitude.
Yes. Yeah. So, yeah. None of these ideas are particularly new, but the combination of them creates an interesting ideology. Yes. There's very much the idea of the cult of death. So eventually, the place where this leads is that it's a cult of death or cult of destruction. I think because it is sheerly so self-contradictory, it does just start to fall in on itself, and it's obvious in some more evocative ways than others. For example, when you had on the Eastern Front, when you had troops fighting for the Axis powers against the Russians, you would put Romanian and Hungarian fascists alongside each other, and the Romanian and the Hungarian fascists would start to kill each other because it was just such a destructive ideology and so exclusionary that the Romanians and the Hungarians were just unable to function next to each other. So they used to separate out Romanian and Hungarian units, and they used to have German units in the middle because the German units were kind of unified, and because it was a German-led project, the Germans were largely not interested in shooting their Romanian and Hungarian allies. However, they would often shoot their Soviet the Soviet troops who they'd captured and then turned into soldiers because the Soviets were seen as lesser men. It was manpower that they were needlessly destroying, as in the case of the Holocaust. They were needlessly destroying manpower, which would have really helped their war effort. But that is because of their ideology and because the war is not just upon other nations. It is upon certain identities and certain people within society itself. It's the World War II to the Nazis was very much a war against a sort of a Jewish Soviet conspiracy, which never really existed. It goes without saying.
Of course.
And that's my example for another example for conspiracy theory. But it's worth saying that these ideas were what the Nazis were ingrained with before they were sent off to fight on the Eastern Front. And it's part of the reason why atrocities were so much worse on the Eastern Front than they were on the Western Front. There was so much more of a brutal rule on the Eastern Front. Shall I go? The enemy being simultaneously too weak and too strong. In terms of the enemy, in this case, it would almost certainly be the example I turn to is probably the liberal powers, the League of Nations powers. So they're simultaneously too weak in order to hold up the international order, but at the same time, liberalism itself is allied with, a Jewish Marxist conspiracy who are going to take over everything. And cultural Marxism, I've mentioned it before. Cultural Marxism, it's taken from Nazism itself. The Nazis used the term culture Bolshevismus, which is the same thing. It's cultural Bolshevism, cultural Marxism. The modern day Nazis use the term cultural Marxism, and that's why you can't get away with using that term anymore, Saga. Anti-trade unionism. On May Day in 1933, Hitler organized a May Day celebration with the workers and trade union officials, and then had them all carted off into concentration camps or executed the following day. I'd say that's fairly anti-trade union, and Hitler also refused to establish trade unions, and that's always a good talking point for if anybody tries to give you the Nazis were socialists because it says National Socialist in the name.
Not really.
Yeah. Just say, so what about the trade unions? Why would they not establish trade unions? Have you ever heard of a socialist regime that wouldn't establish trade unions, but we consider an actual socialist regime? Being anti-judiciary comes as a part of what the Nazis were. There's it's Ernst Frankl who uses the term the dual state. Now, there are two states within each other which interact with each other inside Nazism and fascism as a wider concept. And these are the normative state and the prerogative state. Now, the normative state is what we would think of as the norms which govern our everyday life. You see a traffic light, so you stop, red for the traffic light. It doesn't really matter if speed cameras are watching you. If cameras are watching you, or because it just becomes a social norm. Whereas the prerogative state and a social and a legal norm, it goes beyond merely what is legal to what is sort of a social norm and what is normally accepted. Whereas the prerogative state operates outside of that. So the Nazis, rather than going through the judiciary, they started to set up their own special people's courts, where they would judge people in different ways, because they had a whole campaign against the judiciary, because the judges were enemies of the people. And those of you who've been following Brexit will know where the term, I'm stealing the term enemies of the people there from. But yeah, enemies of the people is a Nazi term. And attacking judiciary for doing their jobs is a Nazi term. But nothing can contradict the ideology. Nothing can, except the ideology itself, weirdly. But nothing can contradict the ideology. If anything pushes back against Nazism too hard, or suggests that their ideas are unworkable, then whether that's intellectuals or the judiciary, they've got to go. And you'd really struggle to establish a Nazi regime and have it pro-judiciary. I wonder how that relates to Brett Kavanaugh. I just maybe think that's an interesting thing. The anti-liberalism and anti-cosmopolitanism, you can lump them in together in a lot of ways, but anti-liberalism as an idea, I think the easiest way to understand it is the stab in the back myth, which the Nazis used after World War II. And that was this myth that the Germans were stabbed in the back by their leaders, who surrendered to the Allied powers and to some degree Jewish people, because that was the conspiracy, in order to in order to gain some benefit which isn't like clearly defined, but it's like generally put as wealth. And this is an interesting thing. If you ask people what the motivations are for, because they say, Brexiteers say that we were betrayed by our MPs. In this case, they are the liberal elite who stabbed us in the back. That's the modern day version of that myth. If you ask them what is it precisely that MPs get out of supporting the European Union over the UK and over Brexit, especially some of these who were quite prominent Brexiteers, and a lot of them who claim that we've been betrayed, they just can't say, because there's no like tangible benefit there. It's just, and I've heard left-wing Brexiteers say this, and I've heard right-wing Brexiteers say this, but the reason that it's still fascism is because no matter if those two traits cross each other, there were plenty of socialists in Germany itself, in Weimar Germany, before the Nazis took over, who believed in the stab in the back myth. It's not something that's exclusive to fascism,
right? But
the terms cross over. And anti-cosmopolitanism, I think that goes without saying. The social purity programs that the Nazis had going on, the exclusion of social outsiders, or asocials as they termed them. There's the term a useless eater came from Nazi Germany itself, and that's the term for somebody who just consumes. And if you think of the modern day and the DWP and the way which the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, Channel 5, those programs on Channel 5 treat benefit claimants, it's not so far, because one of the things I think it's good to have an understanding of is that our society is not so far from fascism as we would like to think.
Mm-hmm.
We are much closer to fascism. Just ordinary people just going about their everyday business are much closer to fascism than they would like to believe.
No, I agree with that too.
And our society kind of leans to the right. So I think it's worth saying. And in terms of the anti-cosmopolitanism, tying into the xenophobia and the scapegoating, I think those three can sort of be tied in together. This idea of radical evil, so evil that is self-destructive and self-consuming, look at the idea of hard Brexit. There is no tangible benefit to this. You can't get anything good out of it, even if you were viewing it from a really nationalistic perspective. The only sign, the only signs we have point to the idea that this is going to be massively destructive. So why do people who claim to love their country want to do that to their country? There's no sense in it, because it has gone beyond that. It is radical evil. It has destroyed itself and become a cult of destruction, or a cult of death. Not quite a cult of death, but a cult of destruction.
It's the emotional gratification, not the actual benefits of the material results.
It's like standing.
Yeah.
It's
stick it to them. Whatever happens, hard Brexit, be damned the consequences.
Exactly. Yeah. It's it's the joy of standing up and crying Brexit means Brexit and waving a flag in the air.
Yeah.
But that's the list. Sorry that took so long.
Okay.
That is the list.
We also mixed in a little modern with historical, but that's okay. It's not a problem. One of the things that we talked about too is that this isn't a checklist of like, okay, if you do 3 of these 7 things. I think you also talked about a grab bag. Was that another thing that we discussed? Does that sound familiar or not so much?
Sorry, could you say that term again?
It was just that you can't have a sort of a checklist of these characteristics and go, oh, you've got 5 of these, now you're a fascist, but if you have 4, you're not. I think the thing is that when we look at how it operates, it's adapting the local, the time period, the country, the language, the values, and working within those. So it's not like you can, it's frustrating when people say, oh, how can Trump be a Nazi? There aren't people marching in the streets. Like, yeah, but it was already way too late when people were marching in the streets. There were fascists before that. That was just when you finally saw them. And I think sometimes people find it frustrating that you can't have, yes, this person's a fascist, no, that person's not a fascist. Because as you say, you can have the same rhetoric and be far right and not think that you're pushing such a radical end, but you are helping to normalize a very extreme rhetoric. So does this sound familiar now from our conversation? A bag of crap or something you talked about?
Yes. I can't remember using that term. I may have used it, but I really can't remember using it. Sorry, I've got to address someone in the chat called Rakis News, who is saying enemy of the people was also used by the French Revolution, the Romans, Trump, and Vladimir Lenin. And am I saying those are fascists now? Get more specific. No, not at all. Not at all. But that was why I said it is a sine duce. These terms are, in the same way that dice are not necessary to define a game, but lots of things which have dice in them are games. It's a sine duce in that sense. So I'm not saying that the French Revolution was necessarily fascist, or I'm not saying that it was fascist at all, I don't think. And I'm not saying the Romans were fascist, although fascism and classical knowledge or myths about classical knowledge are integrally linked. There are links there. The Roman salute was adopted by the Nazis for a reason. So in terms of being more specific, I'm sorry, we can't be more specific because it doesn't work like that. These terms are loosely defined, and that's why defining them is so horrible.
But they're also loosely defined because they need to be flexible enough to encompass an adapting ideology. It's not like the Roman Catholic Church where its form stays the same all the time. We have guys marching now in khakis and, golf shirts, not SS uniforms. So that's a big difference, I think, in that it has to be a conceptual linking, clustering, and it has to be anti-Marxist and probably, linked up with capitalism and be socially conservative. It has to be right-wing as well. So the French Revolution, I don't really think was pro-capitalist. I don't really, or anti-Marxist. So how could it be fascist in that way? So it's a triangulation of things, not a checklist or points where, if you get 15 points now, congratulations, you're a fascist. You really should examine your life goals, kind of thing.
Yes, yeah. And although there is flexibility on certain things, there are certain things like the cosmopolitanism and this idea of palingenesis that the regimes just can't do without. They can't possibly not have these ideas in them, because otherwise they are just, by definition, they don't work as fascism. And you can't have a left-wing fascist. That just isn't a thing.
It's like having a rock made of, a plant made of rock. You're like, no, it's either a plant or it's a rock. It can't be both. You can't do those things together. Rocks don't grow. Plants are alive. Right. So, did you see 250's question? I don't know if we want to jump into this at this point. We haven't talked too much. Oh, no, go ahead.
On Roman fascism.
Yep.
The idea of Roman fascism. Yeah, I think in terms of ancient regimes, we're talking about some very different ideologies. And
wouldn't it be considered more authoritarianism, not totalitarianism, because the Romans just really wanted to collect tax money and beat heads if people stepped out of line, but they were quite happy for them to practice their own religions. They had to adopt Roman laws, but they weren't all-encompassing and sort of imposing Roman culture on the people that they conquered.
Yeah, you're right in saying that there's an element of kind of cosmopolitan. It's not cosmopolitanism exactly, but it's something close. But just the context of things over 1,000 years ago, it's really difficult or over 2,000 years ago, is really difficult to apply to modern day.
And I think it's a mistake. I mean, it's one thing to take things from the old times that we draw on and compare them to modern day, but considering, fascism came up, as you mentioned, it's distinctly anti-Marxist. And that couldn't have happened before Marx. So as modern fascism as we know it, we can talk about, I think, totalitarianism and authoritarian regimes. But I don't see how Romans could have been considered fascist by the way that we've been operating with that definition tonight.
Yeah, and I just don't think it makes sense to mix those two up. I think this is complicated enough as it is. Trying to pin down these terms is complicated enough as it is. It doesn't need to be more complicated by trying to bring in the ancients and trying to compare things which just don't work as comparisons. Sort of authoritarianism back then was the norm, whereas now the norm today and for the last sort of 100, 200 years is republicanism, and if not republicanism, then democracy.
Right. In certain Western European and but like not all over the world, but yeah, our norms. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
We've been fortunate enough to have those democratic norms.
Yes. Yeah. But that's why I termed it Republican, because even in lots of authoritarian countries now, there is a sort of a sharing of power rather than a complete kind of top-down structuring of society from a sharp pyramid point, if you like. I guess that was kind of my point. But I'm not talking about necessarily a perfect democracy either. I'm not putting the pyramid either way up, if that makes sense.
Right. Got it. Okay. So what when you look around then today at you talked a lot, you gave Brexit examples, but also you must see some examples from other parts of the world too, because there is a rise of this sort of right-wing power taking, people achieving political power, not just in the United States and the UK, but your show, you guys look at people from all around the world, right? So you're seeing this disturbing trend.
Oh yeah, it keeps going, and it's honestly, I spoke briefly about the order castles, which in German is something like Orgensbergen, I think. I don't speak German. it wasn't part of my course. I didn't have to learn that.
You have to type it out for me. I'll see if I can
Yes,
pronounce it.
these order castles were they were named after the medieval monasteries where the knights of old, the Templar knights, would go to study, and this obsession with medieval culture as well strongly runs throughout fascism. And so when you see somebody with a knight as their profile picture on social media, I always immediately think, okay, well, the SA and the SS would have been really into that. They would have quite liked that. It's sort of this obsession with medieval culture is.
Or they could just really like Renaissance fairs.
They could do. However, there's a worrying trend there.
Probably be quite. I'm sure maybe the art style might be different, and the symbols used might be different, but
and the accuracy, I think, of the general historical. Like a lot of the time, it will be St. George fighting a dragon rather than an actual kind of link to real historical places. But the order castles, they were sort of an institution where people would go to become, ideally, to become educated to lead the regime in the future. And it's interesting how much of a crossover that is with Steve Bannon's recent taking over of a monastery in Italy, more or less for the same purposes, because he wanted to have a political education for a set of people around traditional values based largely on mythological idea of a white history which never really existed.
Right. Okay, so when going through your list, I'm just trying to think, because obviously it's well, if I could just make it about me now in America, if we could for a while. At first I thought Trump was like a con man. Mostly I thought he was a con man. And then, as of course the investigations came out, and also he started to act. In his first year he was restrained, but as he's been going all along, he's becoming less and less restrained. All of the norms are falling away. And I think abandonment of norms, wasn't that one of the points we brought up?
Yes, yeah. So this, I've forgotten what it fell under now. But I kind of, it was in the dual state. That was it. It was in the dual state. So the prerogative state, actions outside the normative state and into the prerogative state. So if it's convenient for Trump, he will ignore what previous administrations will do. And I know you said you want to keep this on Trump for a second, but I have to point out that Theresa May does this as well. And Theresa May deliberately ignored parliamentary norms when she was voted down by the largest majority for 60 to 100 years. I can't remember exactly how many years it was, which was enough for Thatcher to resign. But Theresa May kept going after that. It was a massive destruction of norms. And Trump, I think, is very similar. I think with Trump, it would probably be the government shutdowns.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, but he knocks down norms every day. I mean, I think the day that we had our pre-show conversation, I checked the news, and Nancy Pelosi, who had been asked by Trump about Trump while during the D-Day celebrations, 75th anniversary, and she said, "I'm not here to talk about the president," and she refused to answer. Trump went on Fox News, had the grave markers of the fallen soldiers behind him, and spent all his time trashing Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer. It was, people were stunned that he would choose that backdrop to engage in his personal petty politics. Of course, if you weren't on Fox News, everyone else was having that reaction on Fox News. I'm sure they were fine with it. But yeah, it's just like every day he knocks down a new norm because he has no respect for like the institutions or the traditions. It's just how far can he push his power? That's all he's about.
Yes, it's interesting, the relationship to tradition, because in theory, if you ask a lot of his supporters, they will say Trump is sent by God. They'll say that he's a traditional family man, and it's things like that. And you look at it and you go, well, what about him as a family man? What are you talking about.
Right.
He is the opposite of a family man.
But who is he beating up on? LGBTQ people. He's harassing. He's throwing trans people out of the military for no reason other than he's a bigot. Rolling back all kinds of protections that Obama set up for people. And so it doesn't matter. This is what's really frustrating too, is that when a Democrat has a falling, like it's like Bill Clinton, modern history, he's an easy example to look to, a Democrat who messed up in this, and not even in close to the same way that Trump did. In terms of like what we know about who he was having sex with after his children his wife gave birth, and the cover-ups and paying women off anyway. But when they get someone like Trump, who's magnitudes of times more of a philanderer and has a worse sort of like marital past, multiple marriages and divorces, which they supposedly hate, they go, oh, well, he's like King David. King David wasn't perfect, but he was an instrument of God. And Trump is an instrument of God. So he doesn't have to be a perfect man to enact a perfect plan. And I just like, what? Oh my God, what a scream, because it's so convenient for them. They never hold themselves to the standards they hold us. And anyway, but that's like, yeah, sorry, that was a rant. That was just, I had to get that off my chest.
No,
I was holding it in for a while.
It's a good point. I wonder if there's a certain element to which we are, if I shift perspective slightly for a moment, that we exist now in a different reality to one that we existed in before 2015.
We do. This timeline sucks.
Yeah, I know. This is what I think it's News Stump keep referring to it as the timeline after the death of David Bowie, that disrupted timelines, and just everything has got worse from there. But the thing is I wonder if we live in those times, and I wonder if the only reason that we were able to bring Sargon to the low that he fell to, it didn't help that he doubled down on his ideas, but I'm not sure if he made a statement like his "I wouldn't even rape you" tweet to an MP now, that it would be taken anywhere near as seriously as it has been, because it was built up over so much time, because he made it at a time when norms were much more strictly enforced and we had much less tolerance for intolerance and for hatred and a poisonous masculinity. And I do wonder if that played a role in Sargon's downfall.
Well, I would have to think harder and longer about that because it's off topic. I mean, it's an interesting thought, but I'd have to play it out, do a thought experiment. But all right, so sorry, getting back to the list. Obviously, corruption, right?
Yes, yeah.
Huge part of the Trump administration, also rampant, and a sort of very profiteering, pro-capitalist, corporate, get in bed. I think I mentioned to you that, what was it, that Mussolini, after he left the socialists, he was funded by French industrialists, and he was funded by other, basically capitalists, who wanted to keep the workers down, and they thought they could control him. Is that the right summary of that?
Yes, I'm no expert on Mussolini. It isn't my area. I've only done brief courses covering Italian fascism.
Okay.
I can certainly tell you that for the Nazis it is true, and if you look at companies like IG Farben, who made so much money from the Nazi regime itself because they were so tight with the government, and if you look at the way that the regime conducted itself during war, now the logical thing during a war is to help your allies as much as possible, give your allies as much help as possible, because ultimately, if you lose the war, you might well die. So, you know, the incentive to offer lend-lease to your allies, for example.
Cooperation.
Cooperation is pretty, you know, you don't want competition between allies. And yet, during World War II, the Germans were refusing to give their weapon designs to their allies, particularly their Italian allies and their French allies, unless they got patent payments to copy the design for those weapons. They were holding back and saying, no, you have to pay us before you can come use these guns to help us win the war. You have to pay us for the patent so that we can then use so that you can help us win this war. And it's ludicrous, because realistically, it was another thing which stifled their ability to win the war. And they were also doing things like they were selling French limousines to their allies on the Eastern Front to transport guns across the Eastern Front. It was a ridiculous idea to use limousines to transport weapons across the Eastern Front. I'm not talking about small arms. I'm talking about big cannons.
Oh, okay. I thought it was like just a bunch of machine guns, which would
No,
still be
no, no.
ridiculous.
I'm talking about artillery. I'm talking about shifting of artillery, because
See?
I know so much of it. The beginning of the war, so much of the even in the German army, so much of it was horse drawn, because they just didn't have motorized. They really just didn't have enough motorized troops, and motorized infantry, motorized artillery. So they ended up moving across the Eastern Front a lot of the time, being pulled along by limousines, because that's what the Germans had decided to steal from the French and then sell to their allies. And it's ridiculous because it's such a capitalist thing to do, because the motive there was profit, not efficiency.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's worth bearing in mind, that the capitalist, corporatist, corruptive element is always there.
Yeah. And you see it with Trump. Not only is he, blowing so many millions of dollars in taxpayer money by going down to Mar-a-Lago to golf 2 weekends out of the month, sometimes 3, and all of the stuff for his kids, like going out on their pub crawl in Ireland. But then he's got foreign potentates or rich people or whatever staying at the Trump Hotel in DC. Some guy from the Middle East who's looking to push him to bomb Iran stayed there for like 29 days or 26 days. David Farrenhall is doing some great researching on this, by the way, and reporting. So keep your eye on his Twitter feed. You might have noticed, too, I changed the lights in my room. Ooh. Or this.
Very neat. How are you doing that?
I have a hue light thingy-mabob, but then it goes dark, so.
Is it a color-changing light bulb, or is it the light itself that's...
I can show you. You probably won't see any of the changes, but yeah, it's like just one unit, and inside it goes through the color spectrum. So you can do all kinds of things. Whoa, that's too red. That's too red.
Anyway, fascism.
Right, sorry, fascism. Yes. Trump. So corruption, obviously a huge problem. What other? I guess we talked about norms. Also, the judiciary. I have to cough, so you're gonna have to pick up. What other elements do you see Trump manifesting in terms of the list that you've?
Well, it's interesting because in terms of anti-trade unionism, there are some unions who support Trump, but there are also some unions who support Brexit. The majority is kind of what you have to go with. If you look at their actual ideology, both the majority of Brexiteers are sort of anti-unionist, and the majority of Trump's rhetoric is anti-unionist in the same way, anti-trade unionist in the same way.
Right, and I think he likes to get endorsements from the firefighters and the police unions and the sheriffs, not necessarily like the workers, in the factories, unless they're coal workers, I suppose. But yeah, generally, the service workers union is not one of his, I think, people that he's seeking out endorsements from, considering how he treats his own workers and his employment of undocumented workers at various of his companies. So.
Yeah, I think the anti-cosmopolitanism linked in with the xenophobia, I think that's fairly obvious from Trump's build the wall.
Right. Yes. Good point. And the rampant sexism and misogyny that tends to characterize the socially conservative, patriarchal right-wing movements. Yeah, I don't have your list in front of me, so you'll have to go through it.
Yes. In terms of other things that I would bring up.
Because again, he doesn't have to do everything on the list to be considered helping move fascism along.
I would say this idea of a cult of destruction, because ultimately what have his trade wars done to American industry in reality? Have they honestly helped make America great again in terms of making it like it hasn't actually helped? Like the Chinese seem to have the right idea. In terms of the Chinese, by contrast, are a very open society. They have their own problems, but in terms of their economics, they are very efficient because they are constantly giving an open face and a sort of open view, with China looking outwards to the rest of the world now. and that is, you know, you can think what you will of them ideologically, but in terms of efficiency and the efficiency of that system, it works a lot better than a closed. I'm trying to think of the term. Protectionist sort of approach to foreign policy.
I was going to say isolationist, but I waited. But and with the Trump tariff, I guess he did some sort of negotiation deal with Mexico, but it's like, you know, all of these fake things like going to North Korea and doing what seems to be like a deal and then nothing happens. But sorry, this come back to trade and isolationism and trade unions. What was the original thread? There was some point that was going to be made, and it's gone now. It's gone. Just let it go. Okay, next point you would bring up.
Yeah, if you remember, let me know, and I will stop. The idea of action for action's sake. I think the idea that Trump supporters don't do a lot of thinking is pretty self-evident, really.
I mean, Fox News, John Heilman apparently went off on Nicole Wallace's show. These are people whose names you don't know and is meaningless, but they're basically like the left. Well, not Nicole Wallace. She used to work for Bush, but she's anti-Trump. Anyway, John Heilman said that Fox News is basically a propaganda outlet putting out an alternative view, alternative reality, and it's destroying America. You're just like, look, you're just creating a second version of the world based on propaganda, and you're hurting America. You're destroying it. So
it's part of the what the cult of conspiracy does is it creates an alternative version of history and an alternate reality in which they live.
A deep state, right?
Yeah, nationalism to them, it doesn't have to necessarily be beneficial to the nation because you've gone past it by that point. You've gone completely bonkers. It doesn't really matter what will actually be beneficial to the nation so long as we keep moving in a certain direction. You know? Right. The idea of palingenesis.
Make America great again?
Yeah. You could. Do you want to add anything to that? I don't think anything really needs to be added to that.
Well, we can see the America he wants to take us back, where gay people don't have legal protections, trans people are marginalized to the point of being made almost, you know, as invisible as possible, and all their rights denied. Women's access to abortion services are basically non-existent. Next, they're going to go after contraception. So, yeah, you can see the direction that he's going.
Yes, and that ties into the anti-intellectualism being tied to the anti-feminism. Yeah, being tied to the anti-feminism as well. There's a huge link there.
And he definitely just really, I think, goes after women disproportionately. He sort of, you know, picks out women to have fights with because he likes to put down women. I do believe that very seriously.
Nationalism, rather. One of Hitler's phrases that he used is that as a national movement, Nazism is a men's movement. And I think that's very sort of potent and worth bearing in mind. He hated the idea of the new woman, and he hated women's liberation movements. Obviously, they didn't use the term feminism back then, but had they used the term feminism, he would have hated feminism. I think that's worth bearing in mind. Yes, conspiracy theory kind of already been over.
Oh, deep state, all that.
Yeah. I'm wondering whether rather than social conservatism, it should be pseudo-social conservatism.
Well, it's imposing social conservatism on everyone else, just like Nazis. The Nazis did it. They played by a different rule book for themselves, right?
Yes.
In terms of how they partied and how they lived. And so, yeah, it's sort of like for everyone else, but at our place, you know, of course we do drugs and we have sex parties, of course, kind of thing. But anyone else who does it, you're terrible. Pray on Sunday.
It's a kind of, it's an interesting thing because social conservatism, of course, we're referring to something that is but isn't. And in the Lebensborn program for the Nazis, the women, although family was encouraged and fidelity was encouraged, for reproductive purposes, the women were encouraged Aryan women were encouraged to have lots of children outside of wedlock, and the SS officers were encouraged to have lots of children outside of wedlock with Aryan women to produce pureborn people. Sorry, I slightly fell apart towards the end there.
That's all right. Yeah, and so just again, it's what's convenient, and also the double standard of one set of rules for everyone else, but of course we can break the rules because we have the power, and we can break the rules to get done what we need to get done for the greater good. So we're justified.
Yeah. And it's hard because they never put it in those terms.
No, of course not. They talk around it. It's all plausible deniability. Or if they say something close to it, they'll just turn around and say, I never said that. I didn't say that.
Yes. Somebody called Not a Bear, I presume that's in some way linked to bearing, put in the chat, Hitler was a vegetarian.
So?
Yeah, my response is, so what? That has no bearing on anything.
It's not a policy.
And also, according to Mexi, there's some doubt about whether he was a vegetarian or not. Mexi had a podcast about that, or linked to that, that she referenced in one of her videos. So I would advise going to watch that because I don't know enough about Hitler's personal life. I know quite a lot about his daily regime and what he did during the day, but beyond that, I don't know.
Can I also just again point out Hitler liking dogs or being a vegetarian, practicing vegetarianism? It's nothing to do with Nazi policy. It's just about one dude. And we're talking about the policies and the approach, what happened, and so Trump can not like broccoli or whatever. He can like dogs or not like dogs. It has nothing to do with the policies. And that's what we're looking at. Not whether or not Hitler had a mustache and Stalin had a mustache. And oh my gosh, dude, does that mean all mustaches make men dictator or fascist? No, it's just can we separate out the person from the facts of history here? Thank you.
Yeah. There's something I read at one point, and this was weird because it was in an academic article, and it's about this kind of precision of trying to find a single cause and a single sort of definition for everything, or a single defining feature of everything, and it was something along the lines of does the strength of Hitler's regime, which was what the essay was about, does the strength of Hitler's regime really rest on whether Hitler only had one testicle? And it's it was being sort of sarcastically asked in this quite serious journal that I was reading.
Yeah,
it's just a bizarre thing. That kind of reminded me of that. It's
Right, you're kind of missing the point if you're focusing on what do you like dogs? So what? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the deep state comparison, conspiracy theories, not pet preferences. All right.
HK put in the chat, Hitler was a socialist, like Crowder's a comedian.
As in not. Yes, exactly.
So that's brilliant.
HK's good peeps.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, I know that as a consequence of this conversation, I feel like I understand fascism, why it's right-wing, how it's right-wing, instances of it being, right-wing and crappy in the past, and examples of where we can see it today much clearer than I did when I asked you to do this hangout. I guess we could take questions if you want.
Yes, shall we open to the chat? Because I feel like there's so much more to it, because
Of course, there's so much more to it. You just studied it for exams, right? So it's all in your head. But it's how much they can hold in their heads. The audience, they're the ones who their brains might be getting full.
Yeah. I can add that economically, the idea that it's socialist in any way has to be dropped as soon as you look at the actual practicability of the economy. The Nazi economy was run effectively as an armament industry. Now, I'm going to go into Keynesian economics a little bit here. The basic way Keynesian economics works is that you have deficit work programs. So you fund infrastructure. And the thing is once infrastructure is built up, and once cash starts to flow in the economy, then people have the money to spend in that economy in order to keep the cycle going. And so you end up with economic growth. Now, the problem we have in the modern day and under modern day capitalism is that people have very little wealth compared with the amount that is being produced. There are all these flashy things that I can buy. I can go out and I can buy, if I had the cash to, I could buy an iPhone X or the latest, there's all these things and they are massively overproduced. But in Nazi Germany, they had the opposite problem because all of the supposedly kind of socialist things that were done in order to fund armament production. It was all about armament production, and Hitler said about his budgets, he said that every penny that is spent, we should consider how it will help rearmament. He effectively gave the military control over their own budget and over their own suppliers, which no
wonder it resulted in mass corruption.
Yes. And what happened was it's a little bit more complex than this, but they started to introduce state-funded mefo bills, which were like a form of loan, but effectively the loans were never meant to be paid off. And they spent 12 billion Reichsmarks in mefo bills that they didn't have on rearmament. And the problem is that because there was a lack of consumer items, because it was all being spent on, the term was guns and butter. Because there was a lack of consumer items, then people weren't spending money in the economy, and therefore nothing was growing.
Right.
And this is we've got the problem in reverse today, because we have a lack of money to spend on the consumer items that we are overproducing. They had a lack of consumer items to spend on, to buy with the money which they were producing to a little degree. That they were making, not producing, making. And what this resulted in is a complete economic collapse, because, or rather, it was heading towards a complete economic collapse. And it's Tim Mason, the historian Tim Mason, who theorizes that this is the reason that the Nazis themselves expanded into the East, because economically they had nothing else to turn to. They were in so much crippling debt internally that they just had to expand outwards and steal other people's resources because there was nothing there. How is the chat? Have people asked questions in the chat?
Yes. So I can read some of them out. Has Cog had any water to drink?
Have I had any water to drink? Yes. I'm going to say yes and not tell you what I'm drinking.
All right. So I see Madeline asks, Cog, realistically, do you think Brexit will happen?
Do I think Brexit will happen? Depends what you mean by Brexit. I'm sorry, I know that's a cop-out answer. But it partially depends on what do I mean by Brexit. I'm wondering whether it will happen. In terms of leaving the European Union, I am wondering whether that will happen. Will people push for Brexit, as I now see it, as something more of of its new meaning as what is effectively a Volksgemeinschaft, a people's community of purity, and a revived Britain, British Empire 2.0. In terms of that, in terms of driving towards that, I don't think that the right are going to stop driving towards that. Excuse me, maybe I didn't need water.
No, that's okay. I'll ask the next question while you recover here. There is a question from 250. I think I know the answer to this already based on what we talked about earlier, but the question is North Korea fascist?
Or fascist?
Fascist.
Yes. No, sorry, I shouldn't take the lead. I make spelling mistakes, and probably I make verbal mistakes all the time. No, North Korea is not fascist. Neither is it communist. The official ideology of North Korea is Juche. Now, North Korea is interesting because it has become so isolated in the past 30 or 40 years that it's really difficult to place it on a political spectrum. And it's a bit like going back to the Romans and trying to place them along a modern day political spectrum. It's really difficult to do.
Really
Kind of
their own thing.
Yeah. it's just its own thing. Yeah.
All right. How important to you, Cog? How important is Germany's specific situation post World War I for the rise of fascism, and how does that translate to America?
Okay, Germany's specific situation. Well, I think there's interesting parallels there. I want to do a stream at some point on the comparisons between the 1930s and the 2010s, and get people who know quite a bit about history on for a sort of roundtable discussion. It'll probably be quite a large roundtable, and people probably won't have very long to express their ideas. But yeah, it should be an interesting talk. I think there's a lot of comparison to be made between the European Union and the League of Nations, and the principles of the League of Nations, and the European Union in the modern day. Yeah, it's difficult with America because America is very different now to the way it was in the 1920s and 1930s. It is a different ball game, really, because in terms of foreign policy, America was interfering a lot in South America, the South American continent. But other than that, it was largely a policy of non-interference until World War II came along, and then America has taken on a totally new role in the world. So I think comparisons there are more difficult to make directly.
Okay, thanks for that. Let's see if anyone else has tagged you into something here. Can you skim my wall of chat spam upstairs a few lines to briefly address it? I don't know what that is, Adam. I don't know how far back I have to go. Cog, what is your take on World War II as a rerun of World War I? That is to say, France first rerun of the Schleifen Lebensraum in Osten per Brest. I don't know the other one, 1917. That's from Voice in the Wilderness.
No, I don't think there's much link, to be honest. I can see where people are coming from when they see the rerunning of the Schlieffen Plan, for example. But perhaps a little bit outside the bounds of fascism and World War II. But with the Nazis, although they were going through Belgium once again, doing it to get around the Maginot Line is sort of a very different thing to what was going on in the First World War. Yeah, they're different, basically. I'll leave it. I think they're different, personally.
Okay, I think I managed to track down Adam's thing. It's so long, Adam. Is it about your tattoo? Is that what you were talking about? The wall of text? Because you talk about having an iron cross, and you don't want some people to see it and be scared, and it would take thousands of years, or sorry, dollars of painful laser surgery, and you're gonna cover it up. I don't. So yeah.
I don't think I know what you're driving at there. I wouldn't worry, because yeah, I think you do have to be careful about what symbols you use. But I would be more worried currently if somebody had Pepe the Frog tattooed on their arm than an iron cross, if I'm honest. A swastika, however, unless it was a specifically Hindu swastika surrounded by Hindu symbols, you're going to struggle to get away with it. But I think an iron cross is, because the cross is such a common symbol in Western culture, I think there's something to be said for letting people off with that one.
All right, so another question from 250 in the chat. Is it possible for a fascist society to be stable over a long period of time? Everything you said sounds like it'd make for an increasingly unstable country. I think internally domestic stability is pretty well enforced in fascist regimes, but I will defer to my guest. How would you answer that question, Cog?
I think it. I'm sorry to answer so many questions with I think it depends, but I do think it depends on how you're defining stability. In terms of, because you see, there was a fascist regime, Franco's fascist regime, that lasted until the 1970s. However, was it ever really stable? Was it ever really a world power? Not really. it got by, but the problem is it had to co-opt a lot of liberal ideas in order to get by, because fascism itself is so ridiculously contradictory that it just couldn't sustain itself in so many ways. And I think the odds of the Axis powers winning World War II was dramatically reduced by their ideology itself. I mentioned the Romanians and the Hungarians fighting with each other, but the Italians and the German Nazis were at each other's throats too. In so many ways, they just really struggled to connect with each other as humans. There's several accounts of Italian counts recalling times that they were with Italian diplomats, German diplomats, and listening to a speech being given by the Führer, and the more fawning Italian diplomats and the German diplomats were all paying attention, sharp attention, whereas a lot of the counts of the Italian side were effectively, I think one of them fell asleep on the desk while they were listening to Hitler give a speech. It says something along the lines of eventually Count, I can't remember his name, I'm going to call him Richelieu, because that's just Richelieu just fell asleep on the desk. He just gave out and fell asleep on the desk. He made it sound like from these accounts, it sounds like a real strain to listen to Hitler, and it just shows the bad relationship which the Italians had with the German Nazis. It turns out that fascists really have trouble making friends.
Yeah, imagine that.
I can't imagine what an ideology about me, your identity is wrong could possibly.
How could that be self-destructive and not provide cohesive societies?
Yeah, I know.
But, well, I don't see any more questions in the chat, although I do see a wave from Robson.
I've got
one more.
A couple of questions. Yep. I think I've got one.
Sorry, you're right. I missed that because they did @TS instead of @COG, so my eyes glazed over it. Go ahead, you can read it out.
The question from HK is Western culture / civilization just a code for skin color? Quite often, yes. I'll be blunt about that. Quite often, yeah, I think it is. I used the term Western earlier, and I'm afraid it's just a bad habit.
Well, what would you? Because I think that's one of those. You would probably depend on the person using it and the way they were using it.
Yes.
So, like, you could use the word bitch to describe a female dog, or you know. So, I would definitely. In terms of Western civilization, that to me would just be sort of like the western part of Europe, excluding Constantinople and Eastern Christianity. If we're going to go, depending on the time frame. So, is the phrase itself, or is it who's using it and how?
I think to a degree you're right. It is who's using it. I was thinking of the West as opposed to the global South, but I think that's the way I was using it before. I could be wrong about that. I don't. I'm not really too sure.
Certainly, when certain people talk about Western culture or British culture, I get the heebie-jeebies. But other people do, like on history programs, and I don't. So that's just me, though.
I had a question about Brexit, and from Gormulus, who has asked that did Westminster start to take the Irish border and the Good Friday Agreement seriously, or are they still cooking up magic solutions? They are still trying to cook up magic solutions. I'm part Irish myself, so I know quite how serious that is, and even on the side of my family, that it's interesting because I've got one side of my family who were fighting the Irish Republicans in the British Army, and I have one side of my family who were not part of the Irish Republican Army, but they were on that side of the conflict. And I think they're still not taking it seriously. They're still not taking it seriously enough. Theresa May, I think, has come to the realization that she needs to compromise, and you can't just run hard-headed at things and hope that they will collapse in front of you, because when you're dealing with somebody who's much stronger than you have to outsmart them, because otherwise you're not going to deal with it. And this all comes under the lack of intelligence and this kind of anti-intellectualism and being a community of action. I'm not saying for a moment that Theresa May is a fascist, but the elements of fascism exist in our everyday society, and throughout conservatism when it tries to serve the interests of extremists and fascists, if you get what I mean.
Yep, I do. Anyway, so we have a question here. Rakist News asks, why can't we have fascism in liberal governments, but can have liberalism in fascist governments? I would say it depends how you're using the word liberal there, because liberal can mean like left as in a political, like in the American sense, liberal as in being on the political left versus the right. Sorry. And then you also have liberalism as an economic liberalism, or in that way. So, I mean, I don't know that you can have fascism in liberal governments, even, I don't think, or so I don't even know if the question itself, I don't know, Cog, it doesn't seem to make sense to me.
Yeah, I would say that in terms of fascist, like pure fascist governments, absolutely. The problem is that they are completely intolerant of liberal regimes, whereas liberals are willing to tolerate fascists. I think is a good way of perhaps understanding it. I think it's quite interesting that sort of linked to that that fascism tends to swallow up and be self-destructive of the people who enable it. And I think it's almost an inevitability of fascism, is that it victimizes the people who help it along. And when you think you are on the right side of the of that spectrum, and when you think you are, the way Hannah Arendt describes it is that people are, in Origins of Totalitarianism, is that people are either executioners in a totalitarian or fascist society, or they are, sorry, I think it applies to fascism. She's just using it as totalitarianism. They are either executioners or they are victims. And the problem is that being an executioner does not preclude you from one day becoming a victim. And in fact, the more you help the regime along, because it is a cult of destruction, the more likely it is to swallow you up. And I think that Theresa May is discovering that, and has discovered that along her premiership, that you can't appease these people and try to help them along with their goals, because their goals will ultimately swallow you up no matter who you are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Do you want to find another question?
Yes.
I think there's one from, what aspects of liberalism did Franco end up adopting? Was asked by 250.
I can't think of the specifics off the top of my head. I'm sorry. I cannot think of the specifics off the top of my head. And Franco's Spain isn't exactly my area. But yes, for example, I mean, this is an obvious one. The cooperation with the liberal governments it was surrounded by was something that the fascists of the 1930s, excluding, and I guess, yeah, in Spain itself as well, would have been completely intolerant of. Whereas Franco had to, after World War II, Franco had to deal with the political reality where his side had lost, effectively. Yeah, I can't think of the specifics off the top of my head. And this is the weird thing about being or having an expertise in something, is that you often know that things are correct from a broad angle, but when people ask you for specifics, this is stuff I studied like almost a year ago now.
Right,
so
like,
it's gone from my head. Yeah,
I know I could find it if you gave me 2 minutes on the internet. I could look it up, but it's just escaping me right now. Yeah, Adam, what's fun is that it was about you. It's just like, yeah, it was like running the show and listening to Cog and thinking up questions and running the chat and trying to find your, it's just a lot to do. That was all. I didn't mean to come across as irritated if I did. It was more like, no, don't make me do more work. Let's see. I think was alluding to what he said earlier in the stream, that you can't have fascism in X governments, but then said you can't have X in fascist governments at the very beginning of the show. Don't know. I don't know if you recall that.
Was alluding to what he said earlier in the stream, that you can't have fascism in ex-governments, but then said we can have ex and fascist governments. That helps. It was at the very beginning. I can't. There's so much of ideas slotting into each other right now, and ideas fitting but not fitting. Some ideas being being necessary for fascism, and some ideas being unnecessary, and these ideas being changeable, and some droppable, some not. That I can't quite pick out what you were thinking there. If you could give me
you're on Twitter, right? You can shout out your Twitter handle at people. And if you ever
yes.
go back, they can connect with you and say, "Oh, at timestamp 237, that's what I was talking about." So we'll just move on.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Right. I think we're kind of getting to the end. I think there's one more, right? If I remember in my entry exam book right from a few years back in 1930, when fascism was rising in some of the countries, rose up non-fascistic strongman governments. Wait. I misread that now, and it's very long. All right. If I remember my entry exam book right from a few years back in 1930, when fascism was rising in some countries, rose up non-fascistic strongman governments. Is there a risk of repeating it now? I don't think I'd help to read it again. Sorry.
Give me a second.
We'll probably wrap it up after this, guys. Just don't post too many more questions.
It's interesting because if you look at the way that the Soviets viewed World War II, they very much saw it as them defeating fascism, and in a lot of ways, the Soviets did defeat fascism, and they saved the world from fascism. But if you ask old Wehrmacht soldiers, old Nazi soldiers who were regular infantrymen, they are convinced that they saved the world from communism. And it's interesting that there's that kind of missing bit there. The strongman governments, yes, but brinkmanship plays a role in both of those ideologies and the way in which they became destructive towards each other. Strongman governments as a response to fascist governments are probably less of a worry than the fascist governments themselves being a response to left-wing regimes in general, because fascist regimes are less interested, as a general rule, in intellectual discussion. Although anti-intellectualism does rear itself on the left, and I think you have to be wary of that too. And I would oppose left-wing regimes that were anti-intellectual, and I am frustrated with left-wingers who take a more anti-intellectual stance on these things. I did see a question that I wanted to answer, but I can't remember what it was now.
All right. Should I give you a second to look it over? And I'll use this time to say, hey, guys, if you enjoyed this chat and you want to see it without Cog, no, I'm going to be on tomorrow. If you want to come back tomorrow is what I was trying to get at. I have my Sunday live stream at noon here. I guess that's in like a couple hours. I don't know. It's a few hours from now. And I have been really lazy of late, but what I found out is people don't seem to mind dunking on PragerU. So join me tomorrow. We're going to dunk on some more PragerU, and I'm going to update you on some awesome YouTube rap diss tracks that are happening. There's some drama. So join me tomorrow, guys, and we'll talk about it then. All right, Cog, did you find your question?
I didn't find it. I looked at it, and then now I can't find it again. Oh, that's so annoying.
I'll give you 10 more seconds.
It was a 10 more seconds. It's Dorian Sapiens who asked, was Rome one of the guys persecuted for having legitimate socialist tendencies, or was he just a threat to the power of the upper echelon? Rome, Ernst Röhm, leader of the SA, and previously a reader of the Freikorps, he was persecuted very much because the revolution that Hitler had enacted didn't go far enough. He was, to some degree, he was too extreme for the Nazis at the pace at which they were moving at the time. It was more of an interesting historical point than anything particularly linked to the direct form of fascism itself. I think in a strange way, you could view perhaps Tommy Robinson and UKIP as the extreme end of the Brexit wing of fascism, in that they are excluded by those groups because they are moving too quickly along this line. But I think they are all ultimately headed to the same place.
And on that,
yes.
I think we will bring it to an end. Thank you, everybody, for stopping by. Thank you to my guest, Cog. You are such a delight, as always, to speak with. So thank you so very much for coming on to the show. And do you want to pitch anything, plug anything? I know the link for the description, link to your channel is in the description box below. But is there anything else you want to plug while we're here? People should go sub to you, right? You want to become bigger, and you're
they should probably go
right
sub
now.
me at some point.
Yeah.
It's probably something that I should say. Yes, subscribe to me. Follow me on Twitter as well. I guess those are some of the things you can do. I have an Instagram. I don't know. What else? There was a couple of things that I wanted to promote, and I genuinely. Yes. It may have ended now, but I noticed that Alice Pope Terry was doing a. She's a brilliant trans YouTuber. Was doing a what she calls a post-mortem stream, which is where she does a stream after the videos she releases. She does a brilliant series called Trans 101. Well worth checking it out. Go and subscribe to her. Don't waste time subscribing to me. Go and subscribe to her because she's producing some brilliant stuff. And if she's still in that stream, go say hi to her because she really she deserves the support. And her Trans 101 streams are brilliant because they break down the ideas surrounding trans culture in a way that people can hopefully understand it if they're approaching it, as I was just a short time ago, from a totally new and uneducated perspective.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for letting people know where to find you and a recommendation for another great creator.
Brilliant.
All right. Well, thanks, guys, in the chat. I've been Christy. You guys in the chat have been awesome. People watching the future, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of this, where I'm saying goodbye. Say goodbye from me and goodbye from Cog. Say goodbye, Cog.
Goodbye, Cog.
Hey,
yes. I did the bit.
You did. Okay. Bye.